The dust hung in the air like a copper veil, turning the Texas sunset into something almost holy. Sarah Mitchell had seen 1,000 sunsets from the porch of her family's roadside diner, but this one felt different, weighted with the kind of silence that precedes something life-changing. She was wiping down the counter for the third time that hour, a nervous habit she'd developed since her father's death 6 months earlier, when she heard the screen door creak open behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. The diner had been empty all afternoon, and part of her had grown comfortable with the solitude. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the heaviness of the footsteps, or the way the floorboards groaned under unfamiliar weight, and when she finally looked up, she saw him. He stood in the doorway like an apparition from another era, a cowboy, honest to God, with weathered leather chaps, a hat that had seen better decades, and boots so covered in red dirt they looked like they'd walked across half of Texas. But it was his face that stopped her cold. Sunburned and creased with deep lines, it was the face of someone who had known hardship intimately, who had bargained with the desert and lost more times than he'd won. "We're about to close," Sarah heard herself say, though the words felt automatic, disconnected from what her heart was actually feeling. Because what her heart was feeling was an inexplicable pull, a recognition of something in this stranger's eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own. "I understand, ma'am," he said, his voice rough as gravel, parched as the land outside. Could I trouble you for a glass of water? I've been walking since dawn, and my canteen ran dry about 10 miles back." 10 miles. Sarah's hand tightened on the dish rag. Nobody walked 10 miles in this heat. Not unless they were desperate, or running from something, or had simply run out of all other options. "Of course," she said, already reaching for a glass. But as she filled it from the tap, watching the clear water cascade and catch the dying light, something shifted inside her. This man wasn't just thirsty for water. She could see it in the slump of his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat, the hollow look behind his eyes that spoke of a thirst that went far deeper than anything a glass of water could satisfy. She'd seen that look before, in her own mirror, every morning since her father's funeral. "Sit down," she said, her voice softer now. "Please." He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might refuse. But then he nodded, moving to the nearest booth with the careful movements of someone whose body had been pushed past its limits. She brought him the water and watched as he drank, not gulping it down like she expected, but sipping it slowly, reverently, as if he wanted to make it last. "Thank you," he said, setting the empty glass down. "I should get going. I've got a ways to go before." "Before what?" Sarah surprised herself by asking. "Before dark. You'll never make it to the next town. Before you find whatever you're looking for. Maybe it's closer than you think." The cowboy looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of kindred spirits wandering through their own private deserts. "I'm James," he said finally. "James Crawford. And I'm not really looking for anything anymore. I'm just moving. Figured if I kept moving, maybe I could outrun it." "Outrun what?" "The grief." The word fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the quiet diner. "Lost my wife 2 years ago. Our ranch went under. Bank took everything. I've been drifting ever since, taking work where I can find it, sleeping rough most nights. Started thinking maybe if I just kept moving, kept putting miles between me and all those memories, it would hurt less." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, years of her mother's warnings about strangers evaporating like morning dew. "Does it?" she asked quietly. "Hurt less, I mean." James Crawford smiled, but it was the saddest smile Sarah had ever seen. "No, ma'am. It surely does not." She should have felt afraid. She should have kept her distance. Instead, she found herself saying, "My daddy died 6 months ago. Heart attack, right there behind that counter. I was the one who found him." The words came out in a rush, like water finally breaking through a dam. Everyone in town kept telling me it would get easier, that time heals all wounds, that I just needed to keep busy. So I kept this place running, kept serving coffee and pie, kept wiping down counters and taking orders, and you know what? They were wrong. It doesn't get easier. You just get better at pretending. For a long moment, they sat in silence, two strangers bound by the common language of loss. Outside, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the diner's fluorescent lights flickered on automatically, casting them both in a harsh white glow that somehow made everything feel more real, more immediate. "I'm sorry about your father," James said. "Sounds like he raised a good daughter. One kind enough to give water to a dusty stranger." "It's just water," Sarah said. "No," James replied, his voice gentle but firm. "It's never just water. When someone's dying of thirst, water is everything. It's life itself. And kindness." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "Kindness is even rarer than water in a drought." Sarah stood up abruptly, suddenly aware of how hungry this man must be, how long it had probably been since he'd had a proper meal. "When's the last time you ate?" James shifted uncomfortably. "I'm fine, really. The water was." "When?" she pressed. "Yesterday morning. Some day-old bread at a gas station." Without another word, Sarah walked behind the counter and fired up the grill. She knew she should just close up, go home to her empty house, crawl into bed and try to sleep through another night of missing her father. But her hands were already pulling eggs from the refrigerator, grabbing the leftover pot roast from lunch service, slicing bread for toast. "Ma'am, you don't have to." "Sarah," she interrupted. "My name is Sarah. And yes, I do have to. Because you asked for water, and that's what we do here. We give people what they need." She cooked while James watched in silence, and in that simple act, the sizzle of eggs on the griddle, the smell of meat warming, the rhythmic scrape of the spatula, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Connection. The sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't quite as alone as she'd thought. When she placed the full plate in front of him, James Crawford looked up at her with eyes that had begun to shine with tears he was too proud to shed. "Why?" he asked simply. Sarah thought about all the easy answers she could give. Because it was the right thing to do. Because she couldn't let someone go hungry. Because it was what her father would have done. But what came out was the truth, raw and unvarnished. "Because I know what it's like to be empty," she said. "And I know that sometimes, when you're at your lowest, when you've been walking through your own desert for so long you've forgotten what it feels like to be full, that's when you need someone to see you. Really see you. Not as a stranger or a burden or a charity case, but as a human being who deserves kindness for no other reason than you exist." James ate slowly, and Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him again. They talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like forever for both of them. He told her about his wife, Mary, and how she used to sing while doing the dishes. Sarah told him about her father's terrible jokes and how he'd never met a person he couldn't make smile. They talked about loss and loneliness, about the crushing weight of waking up every morning to face a world that felt fundamentally wrong without the people they'd loved. It was nearly midnight when Sarah finally flipped the "open" sign to "closed" and locked the front door. James had offered to leave a dozen times, but each time, she'd poured more coffee, asked another question, shared another memory. The truth was, she didn't want him to leave. For the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel like she was drowning in solitude. "I should find somewhere to bed down for the night," James said, standing and stretching. "Maybe there's a spot out back, or there's a room upstairs," Sarah heard herself say. "It was my father's. I haven't. I couldn't bring myself to go through his things yet. But there's a bed, clean sheets. You're welcome to it." James looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with pride, with the weight of accepting yet another kindness from this stranger who had already given him so much. "Just for tonight," he said finally. And tomorrow, I'll help out around here. Fix whatever needs fixing, earn my keep. It's the least I can do. Tomorrow turned into a week. Then 2. Then a month. James Crawford proved to be a man of his word and then some. He fixed the leaking roof Sarah had been ignoring, repaired the temperamental ice machine, painted the exterior where the desert sun had bleached it nearly white. But more than that, he filled the diner with something it had been missing, with something Sarah had been missing. Life. The regulars noticed the change immediately. Old Tom Hendricks, who'd been eating breakfast at the counter every morning for 30 years, commented that Sarah seemed lighter somehow. Like someone lifted a weight off your shoulders, he said, gesturing with his fork. That new handyman of yours seems to be working out pretty well. Sarah smiled, pouring him more coffee. He's more than a handyman, she said, then blushed at her own words. Because somewhere between fixing the roof and repainting the sign, between the early morning coffee conversations and the late-night dishwashing sessions where they worked side by side in comfortable silence, something had shifted. What had started as simple kindness, as one lonely person reaching out to another, had deepened into something neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. James felt it too. Sarah could tell by the way he lingered at breakfast, finding reasons to delay heading out to whatever project he'd assigned himself that day. By the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, not with the desperate hunger of a man who'd been alone too long, but with something gentler, more profound. Like someone who'd been walking through darkness and had finally, unexpectedly, found a light to guide him home. It was on a Tuesday evening, during the quiet hour between the dinner rush and closing, that everything changed. Sarah was balancing the register while James swept the floor, and the radio was playing something soft and old-fashioned that neither of them really listened to until it suddenly shifted to a song that made James freeze mid-sweep. That's. His voice cracked. That was Mary's favorite song. Sarah looked up to see tears streaming down his weathered face, his whole body rigid with remembered pain. She abandoned the register and went to him, and without thinking, without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around him and held on tight. James collapsed into her embrace like a man who'd been holding himself together through sheer force of will and had finally been given permission to break. He sobbed against her shoulder, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and bottomless inside him. And Sarah held him through all of it, her own tears falling silently into his hair, because she understood. God, did she understand? I'm sorry, he gasped when he could finally speak again. I'm so sorry, I shouldn't. Stop, Sarah said firmly, pulling back just enough to look him in the eyes. Don't you dare apologize for grieving. Don't you dare apologize for being human. It's been 2 years, James said. I should be over it by now. I should be able to hear a damn song without falling apart. Says who? Sarah challenged. Who makes these rules about how long we're allowed to miss the people we love? Who decided that grief has an expiration date? James looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah saw the exact moment when he understood what she'd been trying to tell him all along, that healing didn't mean forgetting, that moving forward didn't require leaving the past behind, that it was possible to honor what you'd lost while still opening yourself up to what might come next. You asked for water, Sarah said softly, but I think what you really needed was permission to be broken. Permission to hurt. Permission to heal at your own pace instead of everyone else's. And what do you need? James asked, his hand still resting on her shoulders, warm and solid and real. The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized that for the first time in 6 months, she knew the answer. I need to stop running this diner like a memorial to my father and start running it like a life I'm actually living. I need to laugh again without feeling guilty about it. I need. She paused, gathering courage. I need someone to remind me that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. That sometimes, when you think you've wandered so far into the desert you'll never find your way back, that's when you meet someone who's been walking the same path, heading in the same direction, and maybe, just maybe, you can walk the rest of the way together. James smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him, the kind that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. "That's a lot more than a glass of water." "Yeah," Sarah agreed, smiling back through her tears. "I guess it is." They stood there in the middle of the empty diner, the sunset painting everything gold and orange through the windows, and Sarah knew that this was the moment. The pivot point. The place where two stories of loss and loneliness intersected and became something new, not erasing what came before, but building on it, honoring it, carrying it forward into whatever came next. "Stay," she said simply. Not as a handyman or a charity case or someone just passing through. "Stay because you want to. Stay because." She took a deep breath. "Stay because I think we're better together than we are apart." "Sarah," James said, his voice rough with emotion, "I walked 10 miles through the desert looking for nothing, expecting nothing, just trying to survive one more day. And then I met you, and you offered me water like it was the most natural thing in the world. But it wasn't just water. It was kindness when I'd forgotten kindness existed. It was compassion when I thought I was past deserving it. It was a reminder that there's still good in this world, still people who see strangers as human beings instead of problems to avoid." He paused, his hands moving from her shoulders to gently cup her face. "You didn't just offer me water. You offered me hope. You offered me a reason to stop running. You offered me." He smiled again, that beautiful, transformative smile. "You offered me a lifetime of love instead." Sarah felt her heart expand in her chest, felt all the frozen, frightened parts of herself begin to thaw. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes to every day you'll have me," James replied. "A yes to building something new while honoring what we've lost. A yes to grief and joy existing side by side. A yes to finding home in the last place I expected to look, in a roadside diner in the middle of nowhere, with a woman brave enough to open her door to a dusty stranger." They married that fall, in a simple ceremony in the diner where they'd met, surrounded by the regulars who'd watched their unlikely love story unfold. Sarah wore her mother's dress. James wore his best shirt and his old cowboy hat, cleaned up until it almost looked respectable. Old Tom Hendricks gave Sarah away, crying more than anyone had expected, and the justice of the peace pronounced them husband and wife as the sunset painted the walls the same copper and gold as that first evening. But the real story, the one that mattered, wasn't in the wedding or even in the years that followed, though those years were good ones, full of laughter and hard work, of the diner thriving and their love deepening, of Sunday mornings in bed and late nights balancing books, of arguments that ended in kisses and dreams that they built together, board by board, meal by meal, sunset by sunset. No, the real story was in that first moment of connection. In the simple act of offering water to a thirsty stranger. In choosing kindness when fear would have been easier. In recognizing that sometimes the people who look the most different from us, who come from different places, who wear different clothes, who walk different roads, are actually walking parallel paths through the same desert of human suffering, the same landscape of loss and hope and desperate, determined survival. Years later, when people asked Sarah why she'd taken in a strange cowboy that evening, why she'd fed him and housed him and opened her heart to him when every reasonable instinct should have told her to keep her distance, she always gave the same answer. Because he was thirsty, she'd say simply. And we all get thirsty sometimes, for water, for kindness, for connection, for hope.